Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this stakeholder consultation on a new project titled Using Systemic Approaches and Simulation to Scale Nature-Based Infrastructure for Climate Adaptation. I would like to walk you very briefly through the agenda and some housekeeping rules for today before I turn over for some welcome remarks by UNIDO and IISD. So today, after welcoming remarks, we'll be presenting you a new project. We'll ask you some polling questions throughout the presentation, and afterwards we would like to have a discussion with you all. Given the number of participants for the meeting today, we'd like to keep the discussion primarily via the chat box for your questions and comments. Which I'll be picking up from there in order to facilitate the meeting. So please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. This meeting will also be recorded, and the slides will be made available at the end of the week on the webpage that you see on the slide here, and we'll be sending them via email as well, together with a survey where you'll be able to share any additional feedback you may have. And with that, I would like to pass the floor to Christian Susan, Industrial Development Officer at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Christian, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of UNIDO, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this stakeholder engagement workshop. As you might know, UNIDO is the specialized agency of the United Nations with the mandate to promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development. And many of you might wonder, how is industrial development linked to nature-based infrastructure and approaches? Facing climate change and the need to adapt to climate change, many of the industries with whom we cooperate have realized that they're depending on ecosystem services, and that these ecosystem services might be water supply, it might be flood protection, have become scarce. And they've realized that their engagement beyond the factory gate as environmental stewards is necessary. And this in line with our mandate to promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development, that's where we interact, that will support industries to interact with communities, with their neighbors, with stakeholders from government, civil society, NGOs, to come up with solutions how in a shared catchment area, in a shared area, this restoration or maintenance of ecosystem services can be guaranteed. And that's where nature-based infrastructure comes in. Normally, when we have the stakeholder engagement workshop, always one of the solutions which is being preferred and identified by stakeholders has to do with nature-based infrastructure. So this project really comes in very handy, because on one hand, we can show private sector decision makers that there is a financial competitiveness of nature-based infrastructures. But if you really want to upscale this beyond this investment which a private sector entity can do towards transformative changes, you also need to demonstrate to decision makers in government that there are economic benefits, that all this nature-based infrastructure does not only have a clearly defined purpose, but it also has quite a lot of positive externalities. And that's where the economic valuation comes in. And that's why we're really happy to engage in this project together with our colleagues from the International Institute of Sustainable Development, and would like to extend our thanks and gratitude to the Global Environment Facility and the MAVA Foundation, which are financially supporting this initiative. Without further ado, I would like to hand back to my colleagues from IISD to guide you through the rest of this hour we'll have together. Thank you very much, and looking forward to be with you.
Thank you, Christian. I would like to hand the floor to Natalie Bernasconi, Executive Director of IISD Europe, for some welcoming remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Christian and Lisbeth, and thank you for those really enthusiastic remarks at the beginning of this consultation. And on behalf of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, as the Executive Director of IISD Europe, I would like to welcome all of you to this stakeholder consultation on this new project on systemic approaches and simulation for nature-based infrastructure. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank our partners for their confidence in this new 5-year partnership. We really very much look forward to working with the Global Environment Facility, the MAVA Foundation, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, on nature-based solutions and infrastructure for climate adaptation. The first objective of this week's stakeholder dialogues is to receive feedback to improve the design of the project. We want to ensure that the project supports to the best extent possible the scale and use of nature-based infrastructure in climate adaptation and in the provision of infrastructure services to our economies and our societies. The virtual stakeholder consultations this week are only the first step in the consultations that will be conducted throughout the project. In addition to today's presentation and the previous two this week, we will be sharing these presentations online and the video, and you will be invited, or you are invited, to provide further comments after the meeting in writing. The project will officially begin in early 2021, and we will have many more opportunities for stakeholder engagement throughout the 5 years, both on the overall project and design and implementation, as well as in the context of specific applications in the individual projects. And now I would just like to give the floor to my colleagues and experts so that we all can learn more about this exciting initiative and the use of systems thinking, system dynamics simulation, and project finance modeling for the planning and preparation of nature-based infrastructure projects. Thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you, or back to you, Lisbeth.
Thank you very much, Natalie and Christian, for those kind words and introductions. I would like to hand over to my colleague, Andrea Bassey. Andrea, who is a senior associate with IISD, the founder and CEO of an organization called Knowledge, as well as Andrea is also an extraordinary associate professor of system dynamics modeling at the University of Stellenbosch. And Andrea is our system dynamics expert of the team, and we'll start introducing this new project to you. Andrea, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Lisbeth, and good morning, everyone. So this project, using systemic approaches and simulation to scale nature-based infrastructure for climate adaptation, is a partnership of the GEF, UNIDO, MAVA, and IISD. The goal is to enhance adaptation to climate change by establishing the business case, building capacity, and enabling increased investment in nature-based infrastructure. We have 4 main project components, which are very well aligned with the objectives and the key outcomes that you see in this slide. First of all, we want to create a valuation of nature-based infrastructure. We have 46 projects that will be evaluated and valued economically over the course of the 5 years of the project. We want to also create an online database for the provisioning of ecosystem services and for the economic valuation of these ecosystem services. Then we want to create capacity by building a MOOC, so a massive online and open course that covers both the terms, definitions for nature-based infrastructure, as well as the methods and the tools to carry out valuation, as well as how to bring this information into decision-making for investments. And finally, we will work on outreach and partnership to leverage this knowledge and stimulate more investments in nature-based infrastructure. Now, this work will be led by the Nature-Based Infrastructure Resource Center, which we housed at IISD, and more of these will be presented later. Now, next, why are we focusing on nature-based infrastructure? Well, first of all, we define it as deliberately planned and managed natural ecosystems and working landscapes that provide value to society. And here we talk about both natural ecosystems as well as hybrid infrastructure. So nature-based can take different forms. Now, why is this relevant to us when we think about sustainability and sustainable development as well? Well, first of all, because natural infrastructure provides ecosystem services. So it enhances the delivery of ecosystem services that can be compared to the services provided by built infrastructure, thinking about water provisioning, water purification, for instance, as just two examples of comparable ecosystem services or services provided. Now, while having these ecosystem services, the reason why these are also relevant to us is that they create a variety of co-benefits for us, for humans, our economic activity, social activity, and culture as well. And further, a nature-based infrastructure can serve as a substitute for building traditional gray infrastructure. So if some of the services provided are overlapping or similar, then we may want to prioritize nature-based infrastructure because in addition to providing these same services, it provides a lot more co-benefits. And then finally, it's not an either or. Nature-based infrastructure can increase the efficiency of traditional gray built infrastructure. And as a result, it provides higher value for money for our investments. Now, why this project in the context of nature-based infrastructure? Well, first of all, because we have seen over the past 5 years working in this field that there are many barriers to scale nature-based solutions. The first one, we lack rigorous and systemic assessments on the potential of nature-based infrastructure to provide the services that we need for adaptation and for economic activity. Second, we see in interacting with local stakeholders and project partners that there is a lack of understanding of both the biophysical and monetary value of the ecosystems that can be treated or used as nature-based infrastructure. Then, as a third point, we see that there is a lack of comparability and certainty of the performance of the nature-based solutions when compared with other assets, built assets. So if you're able to build the understanding and we can quantify the impacts and the outcomes, positive and negative, of each of these investments, then we need to be able to compare, to provide options to policymakers. That comparability is lacking at the moment. Then at the same time, if you go a bit deeper, it's important to have sound methods, and this is one of the gaps we want to address, to be able to estimate the capital cost, the operating cost, and direct and indirect revenue streams of nature-based infrastructure. Now, this is to make sure that we can compare upfront capital costs, for instance, with ongoing operation in the operation maintenance expenditure. So that is an important factor we need to overcome. And then finally, nature-based solutions and nature-based infrastructure are being analyzed more and more, but we lack that track record that makes sure that we can have higher predictability for the outcomes of the investments and provide the results with more confidence on the possible outcomes in the medium and longer term for this type of investments. So now I'll pass the word over to Lisbeth for a question to start engaging you in providing inputs onto the project and how we should structure it.
Thank you, Andrea. And with that, I will also ask Sophia to launch the first poll, where we would like to know from you, in the experiences that you have throughout your work with your knowledge on nature-based infrastructure, what are the top 3 barriers for you to scaling the use of nature-based infrastructure? We put, based on our research and our experiences, a series of potential answers there. But if there are some that are absent and you see other barriers, please feel free to write them in the chat. We'll give you a minute or so to read through. So the answers we see coming in more dominantly are about the valuation of the MBI in monetary value, as well as the comparison with the lack or the uncertainty about the financial return of MBI compared to gray infrastructure. Those seem to be the more dominant answers at the moment. There's also quite some votes for the lack of capacity, as well as understanding MBI as a way to deliver infrastructure services. In the chat, we see also people responding, the lack of cross-sectoral collaboration, the lack of track records. We also see people mentioning a barrier being corruption. Channels for cooperation between traditional infrastructure developers are already there and difficult to move. So kind of a lock-in. national and international engineering norms and standards. This is actually something that we also saw coming back in the first stakeholder consultation we had this week. Very useful. Thank you very much. Sophia, I think we can close the poll, and it would be great if you could briefly show the results. So as you see, many of the barriers mentioned certainly scored, with the more dominant one, the uncertainty about the financial return, the valuations, and the lack of capacity. And we are, of course, taking with us the things you mentioned in the comments. And this is something that we'd like to come back to at the end of the presentation, because we'd like to hear more about whether this project, according to you, is sufficiently addressing those barriers, or what we can do to improve that. So with that, Sophia, we can stop sharing the results, and Andrea, back over to you.
Yes, thank you. So now that we have reviewed what are the main barriers, we can move on to discuss about the project components and what we are doing to address these barriers. So component 1 has to do with the valuation of nature-based infrastructure. So here we'll be able to work on 6 project valuations in the first year and 10 project valuations in each of the following 4 years of the project, so that we have a total of 46 assessments that are performed over the 5 years. Now, what we will do in this case is to quantify ecosystem services, so starting from the biophysical value, and then add the dollar value of the services provided, as well as the co-benefits. For instance, we'll track employment creation, income creation as a result of the investments in nature-based solutions. Then what we will do is that we'll determine what is the dollar value for capital and operating costs of traditional gray infrastructure that could be used to deliver the same services. So now we'll be able to compare the options, the total investments upfront, operation and maintenance costs, as well as co-benefits generated by both nature-based solutions and gray infrastructure. Now that comparability will allow us to determine what is the fit for the purpose in terms of delivery of services, as well as support to development at the local level, as well as national level, depending on the size of projects. Then ultimately, we will carry out scenario analysis to make sure that we can see how the different infrastructure options will be able to cope with climate change, for instance, or with policies related to climate change, for instance, the introduction of a carbon price, or changes in forecasts in precipitation and temperature using different climate scenarios. Now, on the next slide, you see what is the methodology that we'll be using to carry out these assessments. First of all, the work is based on the Sustainable Asset Valuation, SAVi, approach and method that we have developed over the last 5 years. It is participatory and uses as a starting point a methodology called systems thinking. This is useful to frame the analysis with broad boundaries to capture social, economic, and environmental outcomes of the project. Then we will quantify the linkages we have identified with system thinking with the sister methodology called system dynamics, where we'll be adding numbers and equations to generate forecasts on these co-benefits. Now, when we add a project finance model, we'll be able to then assess the financial performance of the project with net present value calculations, internal rate of return, as well as societal return. So the return for society as a whole, by including information on the co-benefits in the project financing assessment as well. Now, each of these assessments, each of these 46 assessments will be very customized or heavily customized to the local context. Now, this is required because we want to capture the unique characteristics of the location where the project is implemented, both to capture the ecosystem services that will be provided, but also to capture the impact on society. So what type of economic activities are carried out, where employment could be created, in other ways, or in other words, how this project can create synergies with development objectives at the local level. Now, to customize this approach, we want to use stakeholder inputs. So the models will be co-created, starting with the use of system thinking and the creation of causal maps or system maps, so that we can capture the local characteristics of the system. So we can learn from the local community how the system works, what are the main drivers of change, what are the critical aspects we should consider, and use that as a blueprint for the creation of the mathematical model afterwards. When it comes to climate information, we have a partnership with the European Union Copernicus project, especially with the climate data store, so that we can directly have access to data on climate forecasts from several global circulation models and downscaled models, and build this data directly into the structure of the mathematical models to easily forecast different scenarios, different IPC scenarios, for instance, for different locations with our models as well. So this will make it for a seamless integration of the approaches for the customization of the models. Now, in this next slide, you will see a graphical representation of the approach that we follow. In item number 1 in top right corner, we will look at a map, we look at land cover and land cover changes over time. We will quantify with biophysical models what is the provisioning of ecosystem services that can lead to co-benefits. And out of that, we will get some information that can be integrated in the causal diagram we presented, item number 2. This is the one that is co-created with local stakeholders. Of course, it will be science-based and data-based. That's why we start doing our own research in item number 1. But then when we integrate all this knowledge, we'll be able to have a better idea of what is driving change and why, so that we can figure out what is the contribution or the problems that different infrastructure solutions will create. With that understanding and with data, we can move on to item number 3, which is the mathematical model, again, based on the co-creation process we have done earlier. And this model will be then used to generate forecasts that we see in item number 4 that will be grouped in different types of formats. For instance, we can look at creating a cost-benefit analysis that includes societal impacts. We can also work with a presentation of results that is based on project financing assessments with net present value and IRR. But what is more important here is that based on the forecast we generate, we can then estimate what would be the potential changes to land cover and close the loop. So basically assess what is the value of the project in the context, in the local context, but how the project will change the dynamics of development of the local context as well. So are we going to create synergies and leading to lasting positive impacts on the environment? Are we going to create challenges? The use of this approach with the 4 steps used in synergy in a circular fashion will help us understand the context and provide answers to that extent. So now I'll pass on the word over to Lisbeth again for the second quick survey that we want to do with you.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. And Sophia, I'll ask you to launch the next poll. Zooming in on the valuation of these co-benefits of nature-based infrastructure, we'd like to learn from you what, in your view, are the top 3 barriers to the valuation of these co-benefits. So we'll give you a moment here to respond. While in the meantime, Andrea, I'd like to ask a question to you that we received from the floor on the models itself. How dynamic and evolutive are the models?
So the models are dynamic in a way that they capture stocks and flows, so accumulation of change over time into stocks. And then they capture feedback loops, as well as delays and nonlinearity. So the methodology system dynamics has been designed to capture how systems change over time, how the main dynamics evolve and shape future trends. So the model at the core is dynamic in that it allows emergent behavior, so different types of feedback loops that may dominate the system, to emerge and shift in dominance over time. So it is a model that integrates knowledge across social, economic, and environmental factors. We normally call it horizontal integration because we cover different sectors and a variety of indicators rather than having a vertical integration, which is where we dig deeper into one specific area. So again, we want to do an analysis that is comprehensive to complement the very detailed assessment that is done at the project level, for instance, with existing project financing models.
Thank you, Andrea. And Sophia, I think we can close the poll and briefly display the results, where you've indicated that it's certainly a lack of tools to identify the co-benefits, but also a lack of data to measure and value co-benefits. Those are the more dominant ones and that actually covered by the lack of capacity and skills to incorporate MBI in valuation in different sectoral and thematic policy making. Thank you very much for that. And we'll briefly continue with my colleague David Ujoki. David Ujoki is the sustainable finance expert of our team. and we'll be telling you a little bit more about the financial assessment component of the valuations. David, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisbeth and Andrea. So I'm going to talk about the financial assessment component of our valuations that we will be doing for all 46 valuations that we do. So basically, the financial assessment is being conducted through a project finance model that we built for the project, or we customize an existing model to the project. In terms of what questions can this model answer, it's going to vary significantly, and so it will depend on the actual context. And we will be also working with local partners to understand better what questions they are seeking to answer with the financial assessment. On this slide, I included a couple of the most frequent ones that we have come across in previous years, as we have been doing the system asset valuations. So, for example, one example that I would highlight here would be that the financial model can show how the nature-based infrastructure would impact the financial viability of the project. So, for example, if you have an infrastructure project and you are considering to integrate some nature-based solutions, we can actually check in with the financial model how much the cash flows are sufficient to cover the costs, to cover the debt, and to generate sufficient, levels of return for stakeholders, for shareholders at different levels of NBI integration. So that's one example. Another example could be, as actually Andrea briefly mentioned earlier, this valuation is going to produce some numbers on co-benefits, avoided costs, or externalities. And what we can show with the financial assessment is what would happen if some of these externalities during the life of the asset, which could be up to 40 years, would impact the financial viability or the financial performance of the infrastructure project. And just to give you an example, we are measuring social cost of carbon. So if there's, for example, there's a carbon tax introduced that would apply for this project, then it would mean an additional cost. So we can show with the financial assessment what would be the financial impact on key financial performance indicators, such as internal rate of return and net present value. Another example could be also to compare the financial performance of nature-based infrastructure to gray infrastructure alternatives. So we can just put them side by side and see how they perform under different scenarios. It could be different operational scenarios. It could be different climate scenarios. So, for example, we could look at a 2-degree temperature change or a 4-degree temperature change and see what would be the impact on how much return and how much return the project generates for its shareholders and for. So basically, these are just 3 examples. Of course, we can design a financial assessment as our partners want, and of course, our hope is that our assessment will actually feed into the financial feasibility assessment later on that's being conducted by investors and project developers. So now we're going to move to a poll as well. So it will be good to hear your opinion. What are the top 3 barriers for financial valuations of NBI?
So on this question, we'd like to hear from you the top 3 barriers for the financial valuation of NBI, and we've seen that the financial valuation of the nature-based component itself is not sufficiently used in infrastructure planning and investment decision-making. And there are barriers to that. I see largely the responses coming in here on the difficulty of integrating those co-benefits into the valuations, into the financial assessments, as well as a lack of knowledge on the value of nature for providing infrastructure services. The lack of track record, which I believe was also mentioned in the comments before, a lack of track record on the financial performance of NBI is also indicated here as a barrier. I'll just wait a few more moments for you to answer the question. But the trend is largely on the difficulty of integration and the lack of track records. Okay, Sophia, I think we can close the poll here. The trend on this one is quite clear, and certainly something that we'll be addressing is the component of integration of knowledge into the financial valuations, as to what David was explaining. David, back over to you.
Thank you, Lisbeth, and thank you all for participating in this poll. So I'm going to move now to component 2 of the project very briefly. So basically, what we have found over the years that there's in order to scale nature-based infrastructure, we need to have built trust in the performance of MBI, and so for this we need to increase the predictability and certainty that MBI can perform at the levels expected. And also it's very important that there is access to data on this, so on the performance of MBI. And our response to address this problem is to create an online database that's going to be regularly updated, it's going to be interactive, and anybody can extract data from it in a user-friendly manner. So basically the features of this database will be first of all, we're gonna integrate all all the other SAVi assessments we have done to date. So it means that even in the early years, stakeholders and interested parties who want to look at these numbers, they already gonna have a long list of projects to actually take some examples from. And as we're gonna be doing these 46 valuations, we will be adding it to the database as well. And I think it's also very important to note that access to this database is gonna be free and open for everyone. So we are not putting this behind a paywall or anything like that. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand it over to Lauren, who will discuss component 3 of the project.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, David. Thanks, everyone. My name is Lauren Wittenberg. I'm a policy analyst with IISD's infrastructure team and responsible for different components of infrastructure valuations and responsible for innovative financing solutions and research in that regard. And I would like to present now the 2 final components of this 5-year initiative. And thanks already a lot to everyone for your participation in the poll and in the chat function. And we have already seen that lack of capacities, lack of knowledge, and lack of appreciation for the performance and the value that nature-based infrastructure actually can deliver is a key barrier for scaling investments into NBI and integrating it into infrastructure and adaptation planning. So building capacities is one of the key objectives that we want to achieve and that we are integrating in the different components and the different services that we provide. So as Andrea already described, we will do 46 project valuations. And this is not something we will do in an isolated fashion independently by ourselves, but this is built on co-creation. Project proponents will submit their project ideas. We will then select the project that we will value, and together we will scope out the assessments. We will identify relevant stakeholders. We will define jointly risk scenarios. What kind of climate change parameters will we include in the evaluation? What kind of co-benefits and externalities are we going to value together? And of course, in this engagement process, we are automatically also building capacity and an understanding of what is needed in order to value nature-based infrastructure. And then we will, of course, explore with the project proponents and their stakeholders what the valuation simulation results imply for decision-making, imply for accessing financing solutions. So we have really hands-on project-specific capacity building, but then we want to go beyond that to reach more people of our key audiences, people responsible for infrastructure and adaptation planning. And we do that by designing a so-called web-based massive online open course. We will design that in the first year of the project implementation and launch that and run that regularly. That MOOC will feature insights of our past valuations, of ongoing valuations. The MOOC will also promote strongly the database that David mentioned, so that people feel actually enabled to access knowledge and data for decision making through this database. And in the MOOC, we will also have a strong module component that will discuss what the financial performance and the delivery of co-benefits, what it implies for accessing different financing solutions, what kind of innovative financing instruments could be accessed, what needs to be developed. So that is the capacity building and the MOOC. And now I move to the final component of our initiative, which is outreach and partnerships. And again, that is of course interlinked with the other components that we are delivering and executing, and all of those components are actually being executed by the Nature-Based Infrastructure Resource Center that will be run by IISD and that is currently being set up. And we will also develop a dedicated website for the resource center, and that website will host, among others, the database that we presented, the MOOC. It will serve as an overall communication and information dissemination hub. So we will identify and build new partnerships through the resource center, and of course we will also conduct further fundraising so that we can actually ensure that all the knowledge that we are gathering throughout the 5 years and the services that we are providing, that we can actually provide this beyond the 5 year of the project scope. And for example, the website will also serve to publish our annual impact report. And then, as we have heard before, we just want to emphasize that at the end, that the Nature-Based Infrastructure Resource Center will also serve as the counterpart for the project proponents that want to submit project ideas. Generally, we are open to all interested parties to submit project ideas. We will later publish a project screening and selection, a criteria list, so that it's transparent how we are going to, on what base we are going to select projects for evaluation. And then, of course, the the resource center will be governed by different elements. Among others, there will be a project steering committee that will be, in the end, responsible for approving the projects that are going to be valued. And now we have another polling question, I think, in order to find out from you what are the most valuable services and interesting elements that the project and the Nature-Based Infrastructure Resource Center will provide. What is of most value to you? What is important for your work? So we are looking forward to your answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for presenting components 3 and 4 of the project. And indeed, as announced, this is the last poll we have for you. As it's important for the NBI Resource Center to know what are the valuable services that can be offered, and at the same time also if there's other things that you think an NBI Resource Center should actually take on and do to help scale the use of nature-based infrastructure. Definitely feel free to put your suggestions in the chat. And whilst we're executing this poll, I'd like to respond very briefly to a question on examples of the projects that can be submitted. This means any project in relation to nature-based infrastructure. As Andrea mentioned early on in the presentation, we're looking both at hybrid solutions, hybrid nature-based solutions, as well as landscape areas that perform infrastructure functions, but also serve a whole range of benefits. And in relation to that, there was a question on whether the MBS are limited to the context of MBI in for climate adaptation solutions. No, that is not limited to, but it will be an important component of every valuation that we will carry out. So under the framework of this project. What we see from the poll here, and I would ask Sophia if it's possible to display the results for a moment, is that there is certainly an interest in the outreach here, the participation in events and webinars, newsletters, finding partners, as well as consulting the online database. Thank you for that, Sophia. This is very briefly for the faces that you might not have seen during this presentation. This is what our team looks like today, and is a very important reminder for me to also thank Sophia and Ronja, who are on the call today, supporting us with this event. Very important. Thanks a lot, Sophia and Ronja, for being here as well. What I'd like to do is pick up a few questions that are not yet answered, I believe, from the chat, and I'll distribute them to my colleagues. And in the meantime, if there are responses to the questions that you see on the slide here, we'd also be very happy to receiving those. So I believe that David has already answered a few questions of Helen in the chat, so I won't touch upon those. But I'd like to ask the question to Andrea on the uncertainties in relation to green and gray infrastructure and the need for location-specific data to be incorporated. Would you, Andrea, could you just clarify a few points in relation to the valuation methodology and how we are taking this into account?
Yes. First of all, as we said, the approach is customized. So we will develop a list of the key ecosystem services and co-benefits to be assessed with the project counterparts and local stakeholders. Now, this will be in a way our peer group to start an initial data collection process at the local level. Of course, we have access to our global database that we have been putting together over the last 5 years and the work done by others as well. And so that we can complement whatever cannot be found locally with relevant information we may find from the region or at the country level. But what we will do also is to run sensitivity analysis or Monte Carlo simulations to see how sensitive the model and the resulting analysis, cost benefit, as well as financial, is in relation to changes in the assumptions that we use. So there will be a carefully done assessment that will aim at limiting the uncertainty with the results and giving an idea of what are the potential risks of the project under different assumptions, for instance, for climate change or other socioeconomic assumptions we could make at the local level.
Thank you for that, Andrea, and I hope that answers the question from the floor. Another important question is again in relation to how do we take climate change into account for both the gray and the green components? Andrea, would you like to respond here?
Yes, it's an excellent question because we're about to launch an important study that we have done with Copernicus on assessing the impact of climate change, a variety of variables, temperature, evapotranspiration, precipitation, and so on and so forth, on various infrastructure assets. So we looked at power generation, buildings, roads, irrigation, wastewater management, and nature-based infrastructure. And this is both for built assets and natural assets. So we'll be releasing this study very, very soon. And the model incorporates the pressure, the stresses that changes in weather creates for both the asset itself and the performance of the asset. Of course, these relationships will have to be modeled at the local level. And that's where we can rely on the climate data store, where we can have location-specific data based on longitude and latitude for customizing the models.
Thank you. there's an important comment question here from Michael on the idea of comparting MBI and gray infrastructure. There's a challenge in comparing the nature-based component with the gray infrastructure, in the sense that it will be hard to find an equivalent gray and MBS project which can be compared on equal terms. What will be the source of data and costs for gray infrastructure? Andrea or
Yes.
David, would you like to comment?
Well, I can start on this one as well. David, feel free to complement. So we will have access to project-specific data for the nature-based solution, for instance. And then we will assess what are the services that nature-based infrastructure provides. So we will use the service provided to find an alternative that is a built solution. For instance, if water purification is provided by a wetland, then we will look for a water treatment plant that provides the same type of output. We certainly would not look for a built solution that provides all the services as a single solution, all the services provided by nature-based infrastructure. We might, on the other hand, compare the nature-based solution to 4 or 5 different built infrastructure options, because we may need 4 or 5 different investments in built infrastructure to provide all the services that a nature-based solution provides. Now, in that case, if you have to look at different projects that are built solutions at the country level, we will work with our project counterparts to find what is the right assumption for data that we could use on capital cost, operational maintenance, and so on, based on the size of the project. So the size will be determined by the amount of services provided by the nature-based solutions. Now, if we lack data, specific data at the country level, because these are projects that have not been considered or maybe not in the locations where we'll be working, then we'll be offering our global database and do a pre-selection of the data that we could use maybe at national level or regional level for local counterparts to review and validate. So we do have a starting point, but then customization will be needed in any case.
Thank you, Andrea. And David, would you like to add anything here?
No, I mean, I think Andrea covered the main points. Thank you. Yeah.
Perhaps an additional comment from my side that relates to some of the things that were raised earlier is that we are certainly looking for partners to work with on MBI projects. So for the different valuations, as Lauren was explaining before, there will be the possibility to submit a project that is at any stage, be it in a design stage, in a planning stage, seeking to get financing, so that we can actually shape a valuation that helps you on moving a project forward. And those will be those projects will be welcomed by through an expression of interest via the MBI Resource Center. And we're certainly also keen on hearing from you today, what are the MBI projects in your field where you think an economic and financial assessment would be valuable to actually push that project forward onto implementation. There was a question in the chat, indeed, in relation to the SIA. And I'm wondering, Andrea, if you, separately from the comment, the response to John from GGKP, if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and also for the wider audience on what SEA is about and why this is also important to build upon with the methodology.
Yes, I'll try to be brief. This could be a long conversation, but the SEA is the System of Environmental and Economic Accounts, and there are experimental accounts that are also being developed. We're going through the second revision of the SEA, and what it includes, basically, it's a system of data organized into different accounts. One is for extent, so for instance, land cover, the amount of hectares by land cover type and use. Then we have condition, which represents the condition, the quality of the extent of the ecosystem that we are looking at. And then we have ecosystem services calculated as a result of the hectares of land that we have and the condition or the quality of these hectares of land. On top of this, the fourth account is the economic valuation, which is based on the provisioning of ecosystem services and then the demand for ecosystem services. So in a way, what we will do in this case with the development of the models, which we have started already in the past, is to equip our model with the biophysical foundation. So we will use land cover as a starting point for the estimation of ecosystem services. There are specific models, such as the INVEST models developed by the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University, together with the University of Minnesota and WWF, for instance. that will be used to quantify the ecosystem service provided. Now, on top of that, we will then add the economic valuation. So our work will be fully consistent with the SIA and especially the EA, the experimental accounts, although we will work at the local level, most likely not at the national level, which is the primary focus for these accounts. So full consistency there and a lot to exploit, especially in relation for how this data can be used for decision-making. A lot of work is going now into a policy. I'm personally involved in developing a guide with the UN Statistics Division and UNEP team on the use of the CIA data for policy analysis. Hopefully the work that we'll be doing with this project will support how to use this data for investment decision-making, not only policy, but project-level decision-making.
Thank you very much, Andrea. In the remaining 5 minutes, I would like to bounce the last question that was asked on insurance before we close. How do you treat insurance as part of the valuation and cost benefit, and what insurance covers would help to make a project more attractive to financing? David, would you be able to come in on this one, please?
Yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, insurance plays a very important role in the financing of infrastructure, and but I mean, what we have seen in relation to nature-based infrastructure is that it's very hard to insure, and that's why we have to actually increase the track record on the performance of MBI, and try to actually bring more trust into these solutions. So that would be my answer. So, for example, that's a challenge that we actually came across as we had some stakeholder consultations, and so I personally talked also to some insurance companies, and it's very because nature-based solutions are so different to what they're used to insuring when it comes to green infrastructure. That's often they're not willing to actually underwrite those insurances, or if they do, the cost will be just too high and it would just make the whole project financially not viable.
Maybe another.
Oh,
yes.
First Lauren and then Andrea.
Thanks a lot, David. Of course, there are very different perspectives to the role of insurance, and as we introduced at the beginning, we are not only assessing, for example, the conservation of natural landscapes, but we are also looking into hybrid infrastructure solutions or the role of green infrastructure elements for gray infrastructure solutions, right? So one other components to look at that could be, for example, if we implement green infrastructure solutions as part of an overall infrastructure project, does that maybe decrease the certain climate risks for the projects, and hence probably decrease insurance premiums to be paid? So the financial performance can improve of a project because of implementing NBI components. So that could be another perspective we can bring into the picture, and I think. And those discussions will take place with the project proponents when we are designing the valuations and when we also have the valuation results, because then we are discussing what it actually implies for accessing financing solutions and what does it imply for raising capital. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. Andrea, one very last brief comment on this before I pass the floor back over to Christian.
Yes, no, very briefly, this is one of the many areas where there is a lot of innovation that we can influence with the project. For instance, in the context of climate information services and early warning systems, we're talking about forecast-based financing, which is one of the key pillars that will enable insurance products to be parameterized, to be based on forecasts for the impact of climate change. Now, with nature-based infrastructure that are more resilient to climate change, there is a high likelihood that this type of product will function, will work effectively. So this is one of the areas we'll be exploring with the use of simulation, which again is one of the core underpinnings of this method, the forecasting of climate impacts based on which insurance payment will be released. So one of the many areas of further research for the project.
Thank you, Andrea. And with that, from my side, I would like to thank everyone, my colleagues for the excellent presentations, but certainly all of you for the incredible questions and amazing feedback that you've given us. This is very, very valuable, and we will be in touch with all of you, sharing the results of the consultations and also exploring new roads for partnerships on how we can make this project bigger and better, and how we can help you in your work on nature-based infrastructure. So from my side, thank you very much. And Christian, I will hand over to you for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you, colleagues from IISD. But as you already said, most and foremost, thank you to the participants, because the inputs we receive from you during these consultations will really allow us to shape the projects that can meet your needs. We might not be able to address all the issues, because we also have to think about it that those 46 valuations which we can implement need to lead to transformational change. So that's also why the Jeff has a very strong stake in this project, and to assure that projects will be selected in a transparent way as it has been presented. There will be a list of criteria for the selection of projects. It will be made clear to the proponent of every project what information they would have to provide. And then the last decision on those projects which will benefit from the support provided by the project will be taken in a steering committee meeting. And the reports of the steering committee meeting will also then again posted on the webpage to really assure transparency. Thank you very much for your inputs. For me, it's always extremely interesting to participate in these meetings, to get the feedback, to really see how we can, well, what are the questions which arise from the practitioners, and to get your feedback. We are looking forward to continue working with you. We aim to start this project, to launch project implementation in early 2021, and we'll definitely be in contact with you over the next 5 years. Looking forward to this interaction and exchange, and once more, thank you very much for participating today.